Of course, ever since the South Sea bubble in the 18th century, governments have been playing catch-up on the, in the so far vain attempt to regulate out the risk of repetition of economic crises and banking bubbles. The problem, of course, as we all know too well, is that regulators, like generals, are prone to fighting the last war, but are hampered by their inability to foresee the next one. But when you turn to the future and consider the wider interlinked existential threats arising from population growth, climate change, resource depletion, water scarcity, energy insecurity, the issues are quite different. There's no lack of predictions of the future issues and challenges we face. Well, if we think we have the time and the technical competence to do so, we could debate the fine print and detail of these predictions. But the broad shape of the challenges we face together over the next 10, 20, 50, 100 years is abundantly plain. So the issue is not whether we know what the future holds, but whether or not we have the collective will and the institutions capable of taking increasingly tough decisions. The financial crisis since 2007 is a perfect case study. Both globally and here in Ireland, regulators and governments failed to heed the warnings, unwilling to take electorally unpalatable steps of calling a timely halt to forestall a crisis. I have nothing but goodwill for our politicians as they seek the consensus that eluded their predecessors to introduce legislation that will provide for Ireland's response to climate change, and similarly at a global level in the run-up to this year's conference in Durban. But as Philip Stevens wrote in a different context, admittedly, in the Financial Times this Friday, he was discussing the G8's response to economic challenge and the Arab Spring and things like that. He said, as the world turns faster, politics slows the West's response. And anyway, politicians have always put their own voters first. The weak outcomes from Copenhagen and Cancun merely underline the argument. We can't rely on government institutions to resolve and act on these future global challenges in a sufficient or timely manner. So step up to the plate. Enlightened liberal capitalism. An unlikely candidate perhaps, but my nominee for savior of mankind. Well, can mankind's collective brain now be harnessed to counter the malign effects of mankind's impact? Can market forces be delivered to act effectively and in concert where governments only fumble forward? Can businesses and the interests of capital take into account the future value of risks and opportunities that arise from existential environmental threats like climate change? Not, I need hardly say, through the unfettered pursuit of profit per se. Some application of principled intelligence is needed for sure. Well, the good news is that investors, institutional investors at least, do get it. The Principles of Responsible Investment, PRI, founded under the auspices of the UN in 2005, now has 850 member institutions, including both Ireland's National Pensions Reserve Fund and Irish Life Investment Managers, and its members sign up to a code of behavior that aims to incorporate environmental, social, and governance ESG issues into investment analysis and decision-making. The successful establishment and growth of the UN PRI is testimony to the extent that institutional investors can see how, over time, the value of their investments is linked to accurate assessment of ESG risks and costs. To quote James Gifford, the executive director of the PRI, principles are important, but they're only valuable if they drive real change in the market. And principles, however worthy, do not provide the quantification vital to the comparative evaluation that underpins selection in today's global market. If policies are to be implemented, their execution needs feeding with data. And that's where the Carbon Disclosure Project comes in. The responses received last year from over 3,000 businesses worldwide form an unrivaled data set recording corporate assessments of risks and opportunities, policies and actions taken. Accessible both directly on the CDP website and via Bloomberg and others, this resource is increasingly vital to investors' decision-making. CDP's requests for information are made, as Matt reminded you, on behalf of 550 institutional investors. And I'm frequently asked whether those investors actually use the data that CDP collects. As I'm not an institutional investor, I can't definitively answer that. Doubtless there are some who think that by association with CDP, they're burnishing their green image in some way. But Bloomberg convincingly reports to us the increasing use of ESG data. At a CDP workshop in New York, a Bloomberg spokesman drew attention to the doubling in sustainable and responsible investment, SRI, funds in Europe since 2007, and similar rapid growth in the US, indicative, like the tip of an iceberg above water, of how all classes of investors are more alert to these issues now than they've ever been. While governments locally and globally struggle, markets and decisions taken by investors of capital can and do provide the means to respond to environmental threats and opportunities. There's ample evidence of growing attention from institutional investors who are getting a very clear handle on the quantum of risks and opportunities. Well-managed companies, and increasingly cities, manage these things well and are doing so here in Ireland. And my commercial, CDP's database is the robust source of information for investment decision takers on intercompany comparisons on these matters.